Okay, so this is the next part of the lecture. The question is, how should the people be involved in science? I presented an argument in the first part that in a democratic society, people must be involved in science. Otherwise, they're not free because science deeply shapes how they're living. But how should that happen? Now, let's look then at these areas that we have considered. So I want to just jump back to this. So there's our public inquiry and information system. So I'm going to look at how could this people be involved in these different areas. The what, the who will not talk so much about this today because we kind of talked about it already last time when we talked about epistemic injustice. I'm happy for that. We can talk about that in our discussion. And we talk about certification, and we talk about transfer. All right, let's jump back to this. So I talk about these areas. So the first one we'll talk about is transfer. So arguably what you need for the people to be involved in science when it comes to knowledge transfer, how knowledge in the information system is transferred and used by the public, is that the public in a democratic society, they need to actually be able to draw on the knowledge that is in that central store of information. So that means that research must be made accessible to the public. So I'm going to present two arguments for this. One is the right to know argument, and the second is a pragmatic argument. I'm going to present in the first person. So in order to have positive freedom, that is to shape my life according to my own values, I need to know what knowledge exists there on matters that are important to me. Okay, so if I care about, for example, living a healthy and long life, I need to know what knowledge there exists about medical matter, for example. Since science now delivers knowledge on what matters, on matters that are important to many people, democratic values then, because they're about positive freedom, entail that people have a right to know about science. Otherwise, they're locked off, they're disconnected from something that really matters to them and could make an important difference to their lives. And that is wrong. And it limits their freedom. So that's an argument, the first argument for why research must be made accessible to the public. Second argument, pragmatic argument. When we look at suspicions against science, that science is somehow, that scientists are just, I don't know, that they're working for the pharmaceutical industry, or that they are lying to the public, then people need to be able to access science in order to counteract the suspicion against science. That's arguably often a lack of misunderstanding. If people only hear misleading things about science from, for example, the press, and that Anderson article talks a lot about this, then they will suspect science of misleading the public. And so also from that more pragmatic standpoint, if we want to make science accessible to the public and make good use of science, we need to make sure the public understands about science. Now, but how can and should scientific knowledge be made publicly accessible then? I think there are different parts to that. There's jobs for scientists and jobs for those who organize our society. When it comes to scientists, they need to make sure that knowledge, scientific knowledge, is publicly accessible. So that means not only publishing in specialist journals, it means engaging in teaching, it means publishing popular summaries of the work, updating about what is going on with science in fora that are accessible to the public, where they talk about the latest findings. So we of course see that currently with a lot of research relating to the coronavirus, arguably more than never before. And we'll get problems with this also. There's also jobs for the organization of society. The society needs to create structures that enable people to actually access scientific knowledge. Wikipedia, I think, is a fantastic example for how that can work, where free information about various scientific but also other parts of the world are accessible by the public, and they're created by the public in a way that's pretty democratic, because everyone can change it if they want to. Fantastic source of knowledge. But you need to do more, as Anderson points out. You need to be able to enable people to tell apart the real scientific knowledge from pseudoscience, from conspiracy theories and so on. Actually, for that, you need education. And you need also good and responsible media reporting, where the media, I mean, where what's happening now often is that while the knowledge, as Anderson points out, is available on Wikipedia, everyone easily could have access to good information about, say, climate change. Still, many people have completely confused and distorted ideas about climate change because they don't have access, because they consume media that systematically distort scientific information. A difficult issue that's coming up in module 12 is actually how to avoid the polarization of science. That is a situation where science itself becomes a political statement, where, as it were, science, this is an article by Levy, where science, appeal to science is perceived as being a statement in a political stance. And so for that, one also needs to, again, involve the people in science in a deeper way, so that science isn't just a thing that works against democracy, but really weave with democracy. And so we talk about the other parts of that weaving together. It is not just about transfer. Difficult case that I'd like to bring about, and that's Kitcher describes in his book, is what to do in cases that have the polling characteristics. That is, there's urgency. The scientific knowledge we have entails that we need to act now, but it leaves open many options for exactly how to act. That's what we have in case about the coronavirus often. It's also what we have in cases of climate change. But there is also public confusion. Many people outside of science are unsure, confused, and feel that they need more information than they have. In this case, science entails we need to act now, but the public is confused and needs more. How can we, in this case, respect democratic accessibility requirements in such a case, that there's democratic way in which the knowledge is transferred to everyone, when we kind of need to act right now? That is a difficult case, and I invite you to think about it. And I think if you come up with a good solution, that would make a very big difference to the country. And I don't have the solution, but maybe we can together come up with a good solution to this problem. All right. Let's get to a second question. Second question concerns what topics should we do research on? There are many things that we can investigate. We can do stem cell research. We can do research on democratic decision-making, on the poor, the conditions of poor people. We can study astrophysics. We can produce detailed knowledge about various foreign lands. We can investigate the coronavirus, climate change. We can investigate our experience of rhythm, as research groups do in Oslo. We can investigate the the layout of ancient ruins in Egypt, or we can count blades of grass on the lawn around Blinden. That's another thing we could research on. We could spend many years doing that. Which of these things should we do research on? What topics deserve investigating? I think this is actually a deep and interesting question. And interestingly, many people haven't thought very much about it. Now, there are various conflicts when it comes to this question, what should we do research on? On the one hand, you might say, well, if you're interested in something, just investigate it, okay? And so there's a conflict between, we have the individual freedom of the individual scientists. I just research what I want to research, what I find interesting. Or we have the conflict, we have the scientific community. The people in philosophy say, this is what we find interesting. We're just going to investigate that. Then we have commercial actors. The oil industry says, well, look, we need information about this. Or the pharmaceutical industry says, well, that's what we want to research on. Or some private company says, or Google says, well, we want to have research on that. And then there's the general public, what the public is about. These things, their views on what we should do research on are going to generally be in conflict. Okay. Now, the question that we're after is how can we make science democratic, given that science should be made democratic in order to satisfy a requirement of freedom on individuals on matters regarding matters so that they have a say in things that matter to them, that affect their lives, like science does. Now, I find it helpful to divide the issues here between sort of the very general issues, like which areas should we count blades of grass, or should we do astrophysics? Very general areas of research. It's like, should it be a department for great grass counting, or should there be a department for astrophysics? And then very specific research topics like, should someone write a book about science and democracy? Should someone write a paper about the role of salience in decision making? Yeah, so very specific things. And there's things in between, like sort of areas of philosophy, for example. Some people think about, well, should we do research on modal metaphysics, or epistemic justice, or the attention ethics? Which of these so at what levels of any of these should the public be involved in steering the direction of scientific research? What should we research? Difficult question. Now, there are different considerations here that we can think about. On the one hand, push toward let the scientists decide. You might think scientists are the ones that know best which topics are interesting or worth investigating. Now, I think that's true arguably only at the very specific level. It's not clear that before you have a field of blade counting that really know whether it's interesting or not. Might not, well, that's not so obvious. But it's also not clear that scientists, they will always know or be interested in what's most interesting for the general public. And it might be more interesting, what's interesting to them. Then there's sort of utilitarian considerations. You can ask the question, well, which kind of research is the one that leads to the most good for everyone? That's difficult. What's the most good for everyone? Maybe that means like we just abandon the astrophysics department because that doesn't make anyone any more happy. course, you're not so sure. Should you think about this now? What about in 200 years? It's hard to know. Maybe it's good to keep around some people who do sort of things that don't seem useful now because they're going to find out things that are useful in the future. I want to focus on the last consideration. It's a kind of consent consideration. Okay, when we talked about the justification of government, we talked about the idea that maybe consent is important. And I think that is the basic idea is this: what research would be favored if we ask people, or when we ask them? So what would people want if they ask them about the direction of research? That seems to me the kind of thing that involves the people in the way in which a democratic involvement and weaving of science and democracy requires. They ask, what would people want to have research on if they were asked? And arguably actually need to ask them about it. Now, of course, you don't want people who have like no idea about what one can, for example, research. So they might have completely confused ideas. So arguably, this can't be completely disconnected from the transfer idea. In order for people to steer science in a good way, people need to be knowledgeable about science enough. And also some people, with their opinion about what research matters, they will never be heard because maybe they can't represent themselves. So this may be the children or maybe animals. Their opinions about what we need research on should be voiced by representatives. Now, it seems to me that, again, that this kind of consideration will tell us something, will integrate science and democracy in a good way, while others don't. One thing I would like to have you think about is that if we think that there are democratic requirements on which courses of scientific investigation we investigate, because only then do we realize these values of freedom and inequality, what does that entail for private funding of research projects and directions? Is that really acceptable, or is that deeply problematic? An example for how this way of thinking about what topics should be investigated might change what we investigate now to something different in the future. So there's something that Kitcher calls the fair share principle. And that is, we should prioritize research to the degree, research in medicine, to the degree to which that research improves the quality of life. And that, he argues, is not happening right now. Compare the amount of research that goes into, for example, the investigation of various forms of cancer. A lot of research goes into this, how this exactly happens, the molecular details, a lot of biomedical research goes into that. Compare that to the amount of research that goes into the investigation of diarrhea. There's very little that goes into that. But this graph on the right shows that, I think, no, I forgot what graph I had here. I think it shows the causes of illness in children in the third world, which is diarrhea, is quite high. Okay. Indeed, so this is a different graph. If you look at the causes of death in high-income countries and compared it to low-income countries, see that the high-income countries, there is cancer is quite up there, heart disease, stroke, Alzheimer. There's lung cancers, there's respiratory infections. So this is before the coronavirus. So cancer is kind of up there. But this is only a very, very small proportion of the countries in the world. In the lower, in countries with low income, respiratory infections, diarrhea, heart disease, AIDS, malaria, and so on, they dominate the causes of death. Okay, so what I'm getting at here is that research, if it really would represent what people have, the fair share that a disease burden disease has on people, we should focus a lot more research on malaria, a lot more research on diarrhea to find out exactly how can it be treated. Okay, that's an example where arguably, if you take these democratic requirements on research seriously, you can change dramatically what we're going to do research on. Okay, last topic. Democratic requirements on checking the information in the public stored information, that is in this case science. So how do we in science check whether what's scientifically investigated is really any good, whether it should be certified or whether it should be thrown out? So what we have is, of course, is peer review. People write papers and they send these to peer-reviewed journals where other scientists look at whether this is really good. And there's a lot of competition between scientists, and generally scientists do a good job at the peer review, and they will not let something be published if it's not good. There's also a general pressure for replication. That is, that some scientific finding maybe should be done again by a competing group or different group. Do they find the same results? There's various problems that can go on in science that these peer review and call for replication address. They can be biased to publish, the results are not finished, biased to publish things that show some interesting effect rather than show no effect of some treatment. Fraud and so on can happen. So there are methods to certify scientific knowledge, check whether it's really good. And those are roughly methods. There's research ethics boards that then kind of address them, these things as well. Now, the philosopher Feyerabend, he had a different and more radical idea, and that's a quote from the Kitcher. He thinks the public should do the certification. He says it would not only be foolish, but outright irresponsible to accept the judgment of scientists and physicians without further examination. If the matter is important, either to a small group or to society as a whole, then this judgment must be subjected to the most painstaking scrutiny. Duly elected committees of laymen must examine whether the theory of evolution is really as well established as biologists want us to believe, whether it being established in the sense of settles the matter, or whether it should replace other views in schools. Okay? So he thinks that committees of lay people should look at the theory of evolution as to be a biologist publish it and say, is this really any good? Now, what are some reasons, we don't see them here from Feyerabend, but what are some reasons that one might have for that public certification? Public should check whether scientific results are any good. Well, see the section why science needs to be democratic. If decisions affect everyone, they need to have a say whether they think the scientific knowledge that's going to affect their lives dramatically. Think about climate change, where we need to do various things. Think about the coronavirus situation, where we are asked so many things about various things. Is the scientific knowledge really any good? If I don't have any say about this, how then I'm unafraid because of that, because it affects me. More specifically here, when we looked at the discussion on values in science, we came to this question is looking at whether, for example, the theory of evolution or climate change or safety of the AstraZeneca vaccine, is it well established enough to engage in some action? That's at least partially a value question. And the considerations of freedom and equality arguably require public involvement at this point. Is this good enough? That's not just, that shouldn't be left to the scientists. That is a public question. Now, of course, there are also reasons against public certification of scientific results. You may think, look, if you let the public decide whether the theory of evolution is acceptable enough, this is going to make science a lot worse. Maybe now the public is going to accept science because, well, they've been asked, this is good, but science as the thing that we've had for many hundred years, and that Stravins, for example, described so well, and how it has produced accumulated data and data, won't work anymore if you try to do that. But arguably there are ways of involving the public in certification of scientific results that isn't so crude and that avoids these problems. Maybe you must, before involving the public in questions about whether, say, a vaccine is safe, you need to educate them enough so that they know what science is and how it works. I linked to citizen science. Maybe let people be scientists, then they understand science. Let people be a part of science, in some way. Then science really working is really then consists in an activity of the public together. Some people watch birds, other people fold proteins on their computers, and so on and so forth. Another thing is that to make sure that everyone's values are represented in science, and that people aren't locked off from science. Be aware that scientists too might have certain epistemic injustices. For example, against people from a low social background, where they're locked out from science because they don't speak the right language, for example. Another thing that Nancy Cartwright, the philosopher Nancy Cartwright, writes about is that there is often a step between, which calls it a sort of false scientific rigor. Science can be very rigorous on some things, but then how that rigorous research matters for people might be a further question. That's something that we find often in economics, where we find models that are extremely precise, that have mathematical precision, but they're highly idealized. And then how that should change policies, economic policies in countries in the real world might be a wholly different way. So I think we should be aware of how values shape science as well. And a third thing is that maybe what's important is that if one has committees that make decisions about various things that matter to people, one should integrate scientists and non-scientists together. So these are some ideas about how science may be made more democratic. In the first part of the lecture, they presented an argument due to Kitcher that science should be democratic because it deals with questions that matter to everyone. And if something matters to you, if matters to everyone, then it needs to be engaging democratic processes. In the second part, then I talked about 3 areas where the public may be involved. First, in the question of what should we do research on? Second, in the issue of how to transfer knowledge from scientists to the public, and third, on the issue of certifying how check scientific research, is it good enough to be used in various ways? And I try to argue that these things hang together. Okay, this connected a number of different strands in the course. I hope it was interesting. Thanks, and we'll talk soon.